Today I'm here with Rachel, and I hate to introduce you as a detransitioner because I feel like your story is so much bigger and really important. But I connected with you as a detransitioner, and I was wondering if you would feel comfortable just sort of outlining, the process of where you identified as trans and went through the whole process of transitioning and then detransitioned.
Sure. You know, detransitioners, we all are individual people. We all have our lives, but transition is a point in our life that was a big identifier. So for me, I identified as transgender from age 22 to age 27. And I started to detransition at 27, first physically due to my health, and then I started to socially detransition.
So you had a lot of health problems. I had seen an interview you did with Vishnavi, I think,
Mhm.
and you had kind of detailed some really significant health problems. Would you mind talking about that?
Yeah. So I do have to clarify, like, I'm not a doctor.
Right.
And this is kind of uncharted territory, unfortunately, because there have been issues where health becomes a concern for someone who has been on cross sex hormones or had surgery. But it's unclear if those health issues are directly related.
Mhm.
Um, so I do want to make that absolutely clear. But for me, I was on cross sex hormones for 5 years, and my dosage was fairly high, a little bit higher than standard. Um, and I experienced liver failure and kidney failure, the initial stages of those. So I was completely jaundiced.
Oh.
Um, I was having major troubles using the restroom. Um, I experienced a lot of abdominal pain, difficulty standing up straight, and walking. And those issues, at the time, I wasn't on any other medication other than testosterone when those issues came up. I spoke with my primary care physician about those issues, and she was unclear as to why they had started. I wasn't a heavy alcohol user. I wasn't, my health was fairly good, and I was a young person. So my doctor suggested that I consider going off of the testosterone. So um, I went on to the gel testosterone, which is a topical that is much lower in dose than the injectable. And I did that for, I think, about a month or two. And then I decided I just need to quit altogether. And once I did, those symptoms went away. I had to work really hard on maintaining a really healthy diet. Um, but eventually those symptoms did go away.
So, unlike other detransitioners I've talked to, you actually started the detransition process, probably not even as a detransitioner, more because of, these health concerns. And so, at what point did you sort of realize that you were going to detransition other than just going off testosterone?
Um, I really started to question my reasoning for it because I had felt uh, very dependent upon testosterone for a number of years. Um, and I didn't always like the changes and I didn't always like the way it felt. But I did have that kind of doom and gloom perspective that, well, I've already started this process and I can't go back. And that was, I think, a big part of why I stayed on it for 5 years. Usually, or I should say, the average person who starts cross-sex hormones is on it for only a couple of years before pursuing surgery. So usually only about 3 years. I was on it for 5 years, so I was on it a lot longer. Um, and I once I went off of the cross sex hormones for my health, I started to realize, oh, I I don't actually need this. I can actually stop. And once I realized I could actually stop, I started to think, why have I been so stuck on this? Why did I feel like this was going to fix everything with me when it clearly hasn't? So I started to really question my motivation for transition in the first place, and I started to research other people who had detransitioned, and I realized that a lot of them had we had very similar backgrounds.
So I'm wondering, it's so interesting to me thinking about this because, again, people come to detransition through lots of different ways. But I'm wondering if you can sort of identify the underlying issues that you had that made you think you were trans in the first place. Like, were you gender nonconforming? In my case, I adopted that trans identity as a result of a sexual assault, and I've heard that that's the case with others. I've heard of, eating disorders sort of pushing people towards transgender because, excuse me, testosterone actually can control weight in some cases. And so, have you sort of identified what your underlying issues were?
I feel that I have, but it's taken a lot of thought, and unfortunately, it is really difficult to find therapy regarding this topic because I feel like it revolves around focusing on history and focusing on past trauma and your relationship with your body, but it kind of gets diverted into this gender issue really quickly. So it's taken me a long time to kind of figure out some of my issues, and I'm still learning. But for me, it's a combination. So I have a history of sexual abuse from when I was a child. I've been sexually assaulted, I've been raped. So my relationship with sex is very complicated. Um, and that extends towards my relationship with my body. Uh, my mind and my body don't always work cohesively. So I disassociate a lot. I also have a history of eating disorder. I have a history of self harm. And I think that that is something I've only really recently come to terms with. I've never been treated for eating disorder, but it is something I've struggled with. Um, and so I believe for me, it's primarily my history of trauma and my disassociation from my body are the main things. I do have a diagnosis of PTSD, and I actually had that when I was initially diagnosed with gender identity disorder and started treatment for that. So looking back, we always, it's so much easier to look back and look at the things that you wish that had been different. But I do really wish that I had been treated more directly for my PTSD and for my trauma and had someone who is informed around that really sensitive area to be able to guide me a little bit better and to sort of direct the relationship that I needed with my body.
Yeah, it makes me really sad because, one of my diagnoses has been PTSD, and I do dissociate as well. And when I look at what the transgender movement is, it really is encouraging that dissociation from the body and this almost adversarial relationship with the body, which is what I got help with when I was younger. All those feelings of self hatred, that sense of being different from my body, of being somebody different from my body, self-harming, all of those things I actually got help with. And now I have the strong suspicion that if I were in the same position and I went to a therapist, I would likely be affirmed and told, oh, you're transgender, let's go ahead and put you on the path towards transitioning. And it makes me really sad that especially women in our position are not getting appropriate mental health services that we deserve to process the trauma and to process those feelings of frustration and anger and hatred we have for our body. And I don't know if this is true with you, but I know that for a long time, I felt like it was my body that had been sexually assaulted. And I was angry at my body. And I know that makes no sense at all. But I really felt this intense hatred for my body for betraying me.
I have felt very similarly, and um, a big distinction that I like to make is that I personally, at least, never wanted to be a man, but I always wanted to not be a woman.
Right. Well,
Um,
and you don't have there's not a lot of wiggle room there because even though you can be non-binary, the treatment for non-binary is to change your outward appearance to be more masculine.
mhm. Yeah, and um, also at the time that I was approaching gender identity things, and when I started transition, non-binary wasn't even really a thing.
Yeah.
I do feel like if it had been more of a popular thing, I probably would have just ascribed to that identity for a while, and I might have saved myself from the medical side of it a little bit, to be honest. So I understand a lot of people are very critical of non-binary identity, but I I really sympathize with it. I really understand why people would want to be able to have a boundary, you know?
Well, it also I mean, I honestly do not know what it feels like to identify as a woman. I know that I am a woman. This is a fact, but I never, embraced or, identified or, it's not something that, I wake up in the morning, I'm like, I'm a woman. You know, and so in a way, I really, like you said, understand that wanting to gravitate towards non-binary because it is in a way rejecting the stereotypes that are put upon women and a way of saying, I'm different from that. I don't want to ascribe to, the whole idea of woman, but I do wonder if some of that is internalized misogyny on my part that again I had so much self-hatred for my female being, and I wonder how many of those who are being attracted to be non-binary are actually, it's again part of that misbelief about what it means to be a woman.
I do think that there is a lack of understanding there. And I think that younger people feel like there is this really rigid definition of womanhood.
Mm.
You know, we've kind of gone backwards in time a little bit with sexism and with how women are treated. And um, yes, we have a lot of liberties, but there's still this understanding of gender roles that is just so backwards. And so I think that at least for me, I know my understanding of being a woman was extremely restrictive. And and I mean, I'm 30. I grew up with so much of this liberation, so much of this freedom, so much talk about all of this, and yet my understanding of womanhood still was very based on stereotype, very you know and a lot of it was very heteronormative as well. You It's still very hard to see examples of bisexual or lesbian women out there without it also meeting a certain stereotype. And my hope is that young women will start to be able to question things a little bit more, not question themselves as much, but question society.
Yeah, I really hope so. And when I see what's happening to women, especially, so many of these girls are turning out to be lesbians. And again, it's, not just internalized misogyny, but internalized homophobia that is sort of being outwardly shown with the way they're transitioning. So from your perspective as someone who's detransitioned, h I'm just wondering if you can help guide those of us who are trying to raise awareness, who are trying to, fight back against the system. And, your experience as someone who actually went through the transition is so different from me. because I desisted when I was a teenager. And so I didn't go through any of those medical interventions. So I'm just wondering, based on your own insights and from talking to other detransitioners, how do you think is the best way for us to start educating people so that they understand that this isn't about being transphobic? It's about concerns that these, especially girls and teens and young women are actually being pushed down a really unhealthy pathway and not getting the kind of care that they need.
Yeah, oof, that's a lot of responsibility.
Well, and if you, yeah, maybe just your own impressions because it is a
Yeah,
lot.
so first off, I think it's so easy to look at the process of transition and become judgmental,
Mhm.
to look at it and say, why would anyone do this? Anyone who would choose this is out of their mind, or they want attention. They don't understand the risk. Um, and to some degree, some of that might be true, but we're still dealing with a vulnerable person, especially in the case of young people. We're dealing with a person. This isn't just about the political issue. This isn't just about the people who have already transitioned. You know, um, a person who is considering transition is really struggling, and they're
Mhm.
very, very vulnerable. Um, so I think that we need to be careful when we're coming at it, and we're coming at it aggressively, because we need to understand that this person does still need help. They need support. We can't just say no to transition without offering
Mhm.
counter support. Um, and that's unfortunately something that we're really lacking, is proper resources for psychological support, proper understanding of all the risks, the medical risks, and being able to um, talk with families as a unit. I see that there's a lot of division, and I understand that it's really difficult as a parent to see your child considering this as an option. I know if I were a parent, I would be terrified and want to just put my foot down and say, absolutely not. Um, but unfortunately, you also have to kind of question what your child is going through. And it's humbling, I think, because you do have to acknowledge that your child is struggling. Even if you're the perfect parent, your child might be struggling a lot with something, um, and they need help. And that's how they're trying to find help, is by changing their body, because that's what they've been told is the answer. It's
Right.
not because your child is dumb, or necessarily because they're following a trend. It's because they legitimately have been told that that's how they need to approach this.
That's such important insight, and I think that that's it's just so important for people to realize that, again, and I don't know if you parse out this as differently, but it seems like there is a difference between girls and men who transition. That there seems, and I think that this is starting to hit younger men and boys, and I'm not sure what group they fall into, but I sort of feel like we have like the older men who are really pushing the trans movement, who tend to be autogynephilic. And this is, about a sexual proclivity. It's not about, um, it's not about these, deep underlying issues. And then we have girls who, oftentimes it is really, something deeply concerning. This is basically when you transition, you're running away from yourself and remaking yourself. And if somebody wants to do that, it's because there's something going on. And I'm starting to see this hitting boys too. And a lot of times it's autistic boys or boys who have been sexually assaulted, boys who might have, just not fit in very well, be bullied. And so it's a very vulnerable population. And I was just wondering, what advice would you have for parents? Because, a lot of parents are, I've seen lots of different responses. I've seen parents who are like, I absolutely want to accommodate anything that my son or daughter wants if they're saying they're transgender, versus, the other spectrum where you have parents who are like embracing it, encouraging it, and celebrating it. And I was just wondering, from your perspective, what do you think is the best approach for parents?
So my perspective, again, I don't have children, so I know that some people won't want to hear my perspective. Um,
But you were a
but,
child.
but I was a child, and I've been through the transition process, and um, I believe that a parent should make some accommodations for your child. Honestly, like if your child wants to dress a certain way, if your child wants to be called, by a different name and use different pronouns, I honestly suggest going through with it, because the more you resist, the more it's going to become a statement.
Mm,
Um, and that's going to really push them further away. I do think draw the line in the sand at medicalization. Your child, at least here in the States, in most states, your child is on your healthcare plan. You get to determine if they go through with certain things. I know that there are states and there are areas where a child can have access to things without parental permission, and that's terrifying. Um, but have that conversation. It's scary, but have that conversation with your
mm.
child and tell them your reasons why you don't want them to medicalize, and don't I would be really cautious about questioning their motivation very much,
Mhm.
because again, they are being told that this is what is healthiest for them. They're literally being told by doctors, and especially when you're young, you trust doctors. You don't understand that doctors can have bad intentions, and unfortunately, that malpractice happens. And that was a lesson I had to learn as an adult. So, um, in this case, I think really talking with your child about their expression and allowing them to express themselves in different ways, allowing them to explore different possibilities for their future, as far as like living up to stereotypes and things like that. If your child is saying, I don't want to get married, I don't want to look like a girl usually looks, I want to, shave my head, and I want to wear, I don't want to wear bras, all those things. Let your child explore that. Because at the end of the day, um, wouldn't you rather have a healthy child who shaved their head and is just wearing what they're comfortable with?
Yeah, and I think that's important because my experience, I do have kids, and when they're teenagers, if once they get an idea in their head, the more you like dismiss that or push back against it, sometimes they will rush headlong into it just because there's that conflict. And that's something teenagers are supposed to do. They need to differentiate from their parents, and this seems to be one of the ways that they're doing it now. But that medicalization, again, for me, that's the line too, that, if people want to be gender nonconforming, if kids want to, pursue that, more power to them. But it's that, once their health is at risk, and again, it's those reversible versus irreversible changes. And the biggest thing I think for me is the puberty blockers that, those induce a developmental delay. So if you can make some accommodations in other areas, to make it so your child doesn't keep pushing for puberty blockers, I think that that probably will, in the end, result in healthier results.
Agreed. This whole concept of not even initializing natural puberty is so dangerous. I mean, our brains don't even stop function or stop forming until we're in our 20s. And we're just going to take away the option of reproduction and potentially the option of experiencing sexual intimacy in a natural way. And we're letting children drive that. We're letting children drive that car off the cliff. um, I think that children can have autonomy and can know a lot about themselves without us also allowing them to have whatever medical procedure they want.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time, children have been heavily influenced by the doctors they're seeing, by their peers, and by the community. We live so much of our lives online, and the community has used that as a resource to communicate. And unfortunately, a lot of the trans community, as this sort of giant entity, I'm not speaking individually, but as this giant entity, um, they have this sort of conversion ideal where they want to get as many people, especially as many kids, on this stuff as possible. Um, so kids are really susceptible to the idea that, if they do this procedure, if they take these hormones, if they take puberty blockers, they're going to live this dream life because that's what they've been told by people who, are telling them, yeah, I'm living my best life because I'm on hormones and I had surgery. um, but we're not seeing that person's day-to-day life. We're not seeing their struggles with mental illness. So I don't know. There's a lot of factors in it.
Yeah. I was just curious. One of the ways we connected was about a discussion regarding Partners for Ethical Care and their use of a poster. And you were concerned about it and raised some what I thought were really good points. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about like give guidance to those of us who are wanting to get out there, wanting to educate people, wanting to share what happens. Doing it respectfully for detransitioners, because I feel like Partners for Ethical Care, especially, and a lot of other groups who are fighting what's happening. Sometimes we don't get it right, but ultimately we really want to honor detransitioners while at the same time getting the message out there. So I was wondering just your insights on that.
Yeah, I have a lot of sympathy because I do understand that, um, you see the results of some of these surgeries, and it's terrifying.
Mhm. Yeah, I
I
should clarify for people who don't know about the discussion that the poster in question was of a double mastectomy that had been performed on somebody,
Yeah.
and I know I've seen this. I believe in England they used similar posters, and I've had great debates about this with certain groups about like and the biggest concern that I hear actually isn't what you talked about, but it's like we don't want to look like the abortion protesters. That this is too close to that, and the optics aren't good. And I'm less concerned about that because I feel like I want to do what's effective. But in this case, if something that's effective might be hurting the very people that we're trying to support, it's definitely not worth it.
Yeah. I haven't had any surgeries, but I've known a lot of detransition people who have had surgery. Um, and I've known a lot of transgender people who still identify that way, who've had surgery that was complicated. Um, I've been there when someone has had a double mastectomy and it became life threatening. Um, I've seen the effects that these surgeries can do, um, but we really need to center the fact that um, this is a human being, um, who has gone and gotten a procedure, um, not always because they're looking for a certain aesthetic. Um, and this person, whether they end up happy or not with the surgery, the process of going through that surgery and considering it, um, it can be really traumatic. Even if you are completely happy with the surgery, or procedure, it's a traumatic thing for your body to go through, and it's really challenging to um, to go through that and come out the other side healthy and happy and all put together, I think. So, um, for me, there's two ways of looking at it. The imagery that's being used, either it's from someone who has transitioned and gotten this surgery and is happy with the results, in which case I think that we should let them live their life. As damaging as we know that these procedures are, if someone is content and they're an adult, we need to let them live their life. Um, if this person, however, is a detransitioner, um, it's really difficult to even look in the mirror sometimes, knowing the choices that you've made and the things that you have put your body through. And I know if I had gotten surgery, if I saw a photo of myself, even without specific identifiers, if I knew that there was a photo of myself being used for any sort of reason, even if I agree with it, um, it would be disheartening to know I was being used as an example.
Yeah,
I
I think
think
that
there
that's a really good insight because, um, yeah, I mean, this whole thing is so awful, and I think ideally we could find a detransitioner who we could put the image up, but have it be an identified image if they were comfortable with it. But again, even then, I'm not even sure as effective as it is to show people what's happening, whether or not using it, at a protest is going to be effective. There might be other ways of using it. So that's something that I'm guessing that we'll probably keep grappling with, assuming we can find a detransitioner who's willing to share an image like that. But I do think it's important to have the full identified image almost, of somebody who agrees to be used in that way because part of what this whole movement is about is dehumanizing, and an image like that where you're just showing just this portion of a body, in a way it's again objectifying the body in a way that I think we're kind of fighting against.
agreed. I think about I saw a really great post on Twitter kind of talking about um, there are so many complications with breast implants. Um, and there's so many issues where the procedure ends up getting infected or there are some complication. Um, Regardless, we don't use photographs of those women going through those things in a sort of broad and outside of certain circumstances, if that makes any sense. We don't flash those photographs all the time. We talk about it first.
Mhm.
And I think it's really important to be able to have the discussion prior to showing the results of surgeries, because for one, it helps your argument. And for two, um, I don't know that the general public is going to know how to respond
Mhm.
to these photographs. They might think they're not real. They might think that you are using people. And if we show that there is conversation to be had and we show that we want to take care of these people, I think that needs to be the priority that comes through. And that's what's going to actually land with the general public because the general public who falls in line with accepting transition as a process, yes, they don't understand the medical complications, but they also have been told that by accepting that, they are showing that they care about these people.
Mhm.
And that if they don't accept transition as a process, they don't care for these people. And I think it's important to prove that statement wrong.
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest thing that we need to do is to prove that statement wrong. And it's interesting after talking to some of the people who protested, one of the takeaways that I heard loud and clear is that we need to show that we support trans kids, whatever that means. And I know some people will really bristle at that idea and say there is no such thing as a trans kid. But there are kids who believe they're trans, and we need to be reaching out to them to provide them with support and let them know that we're concerned. Because if they just view us as a bunch of hateful women, primarily women, but a bunch of hateful, people out in front of a gender clinic, flashing these images, it's going to be hard for them to feel like we're there for them. I mean, I really think that you've made an acute observation, and I really appreciate your sharing your insights because I feel like you just have such a gentle way of pointing things out, and I think that's really important. And I guess one of the things that I wanted to ask you is you didn't go through this as a really young person, but if you have any advice you would give to teenagers or young adults who believe that they're trans, and think that this is the right path.
Um, it's difficult because as, when we started this conversation, I was telling you about sort of what led to my or what I discovered had led to my transition for motivation reasons. And everybody's different. However, we are seeing some some congruent lines. We are seeing some consistencies. So for anybody who's questioning, I would suggest to take this on as your own independent self, because when you are engrossed in the trans community, you get a lot of the love bombing, you get a lot of the culture of acceptance of this is your family, this is the right decision for you. But those people don't have to live with your decisions, you do. And I think it's really important too to acknowledge that there's probably some mental health issues that you haven't addressed.
Mhm.
It's frustrating, because you want gender identity to be the one thing, because that means there's one fix.
Mhm.
Um, but unfortunately, that's not really how it works most of the time. There's usually a lot of different mental health issues that you have to work on, and it is work. It's really difficult.
Yeah.
Um,
One of the things that I really feel is unfortunate about the whole trans movement is I believe that it's increasingly stigmatizing mental health issues because the narrative is we don't have a mental health issue. There's nothing wrong with us. We're just transgender. And it's like they're almost insisting, it by doing that, it's almost suggesting that there's something wrong with having a mental health issue, by saying, there's nothing wrong with us. We actually just are born in the wrong body, and that's something that's been really frustrating to me because I was aware, you know. Probably by the time I was a teenager, I was very aware that my, gender dysphoria was a mental health issue, along with, all the other things that came along with it. Um, However, if somebody had come up to me and said, "Oh, no, you don't have a mental health issue. You're just transgender," I would be like, "Oh, great. That's so much easier." And I wouldn't have, I mean, like you said, dealing with mental health issues is a lot of work, and it would have sort of let me off the hook in the short term. But I also know in the long term that if I didn't get help for all of those issues, I would have just increasingly been a mess, the self-destructive tendencies that I had, this, setting myself up for failure, all of these things that I did that were connected with, all the mental health issues. If I hadn't gotten help for them, would have just kept getting worse. But the transgender movement sort of allows us to hide under a blanket for a while and pretend like there's nothing wrong. But eventually, either we're going to realize like there is something wrong or we're going to self destruct, I think.
I completely agree, and it it breaks my heart to know that there are people out there who are struggling with mental illness who, would rather who are convinced that what they should do is go and get these procedures done instead of actually getting comprehensive care. Um, there's a real lack in mental health care for dealing with people's approach to trauma, people's approach to disassociation. And I think that there needs to be a better understanding that if you are experiencing gender dysphoria or sex dysphoria, it's very likely that there's some other things at play. Um, and the transgender movement, again, I'm using that as sort of a broad statement, but the way that they have argued against gender identity disorder as a disorder, the way they've argued against labeling it as mental illness or even a facet of mental illness or result of mental illness, they push so hard against that.
Yeah.
It kind of it's very much, I think they doth protest too much.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is very strange to me that they're so adamant about it. And again, I feel like that's just adding to the stigmatization of those of us who have suffered from mental illness, and
Mhm.
and trying to, validate their healthiness. And I think it's really sad because I mean, it's sort of like the feminist movement. I feel like we sort of have gone backwards with stereotypes and all that. So everything that the feminist movement sort of was fighting for, we've sort of regressed on as a result of this movement. And I feel like the same thing is true with mental health, that we were just getting to a point where it seemed like we were starting to accept that, to be more honest about mental health and not just stigmatize it. And now it's like we're going back on that too. It's like all these strides that we made are being undone by this movement that is really at the heart of it is pushing kids to damage themselves.
And there I will say, there are transgender people who are living very openly with certain conditions and uh, certain factors of neurodivergence and mental illness, and they talk about it, um, and they talk about erasing the stigma from it. Um, but I do think there needs to be an understanding that if you have gender identity issues, that there's disassociation happening there. It's like you're saying, the stigma of saying that, having these mental issues in relation to transition is a bad thing is taking us back so far, when in reality we could just say no, it's a fact. If you are having issues with your body to such a degree that it causes you daily stress, there's something going on there and you need to address it. We need to treat it, and not with cross-sex hormones or surgery. We need to treat it with mental health treatments. We need to address it with a therapist who really understands. um, and yeah, it's just, for me personally, I had so many mental health issues. um, and I buried most of them. I knew I had some PTSD. I knew I had some trauma there. Um, but I buried it all, and I went into transition thinking this is going to be the difference that I need.
Mhm.
um, and what I ended up doing was actually creating a bigger problem because I was trying so hard to separate myself from my mental health issues that they just sort of built up and built up and built up. And so we're going to end up with a lot of people who I think are disappointed by transition because they've convinced themselves that this is the only thing that they need. And they've been told that, they've been reaffirmed that by doctors and therapists, that that's the only thing that they need. They don't really need mental health medication. They don't need to go through psychological treatment for their issues.
Right.
Um,
Well, and some of these issues I feel like are actually societal issues that we should be fighting as a society rather than rather than just embracing the these very regressive stereotypes of sex and gender, that we should be fighting against them, and instead, um, a lot of the trans movement is doing is actually reinforcing those stereotypes, and to me that's so heartbreaking. I mean, it, I would like to see people empowered and saying, you know what, I can be a woman even if I don't adhere to these gender stereotypes. And for older women like me, I feel like we need to be standing up and supporting younger women when they make these decisions to kind of push back against gender stereotypes. I am shocked that it's still considered sort of professional attire to wear high heels in 2021. I mean,
Mhm.
that was something that we should have gotten rid of a long time ago, because it's dangerous for women to wear high heels. I remember seeing a video when I was younger, showing the difference between a woman running away from a predator in tennis shoes versus high heels. And it just was shocking. I was like, oh wow. And sort of how high heels keep us defenseless in a way, because they put us off balance and they sexualize us and all these things. And I'm like, why aren't we fighting against that rather than,
Yeah,
that's where I just get frustrated. And I'm not sure where we went off the rails. It just seemed like we were sort of headed in that direction. When I was a little girl, there was a Lego ad that came out and it showed sort of a scruffy little girl playing with Legos. And that was so cool. Now we have pink Legos. I'm like,
yeah,
what? Why? Why did we do that? And I think a lot of it is about marketing and money, and people have decided to embrace this ideology because there's so much money involved. There's the marketing, there's the medications, there's all the branding that goes on with it, which you don't get if just by women simply rejecting harmful stereotypes.
I think too, and this isn't a judgment because I've ascribed to hyperfemininity a lot in the past. I still ascribe to some aspects of femininity that I feel are um, misogynistic, that I have to fight within myself a little bit about. Um, However, I think it's a lot more comfortable to fall in line as a
Mhm.
woman and say, OnlyFans is empowering, high heels are empowering. As long as I accept it, then it's empowering.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and the idea of not accepting it, the idea of rejection, um, is so stigmatizing, especially when as soon as you reject something, someone's going to say, "Oh, well, you must be trans because you don't ascribe to these things."
Mhm.
And it's so hard to come out and be like, "Well, no, I am still a woman
Mhm.
and I don't like these things and they are harmful to me as a woman and
Mhm.
I am not trans because I reject these things. I am simply a woman."
Yeah, yeah, it's so sad. And again, I feel like that's the message that little girls are getting now, is that if they're not hyper feminine, they're trans. And I have no doubt that I would have been medicalized, but now I have no doubt that all three of my children would have been told that they were transgender, because I brought them up in a home that wasn't, that didn't force these regressive stereotypes on them, and so they didn't adhere to them. And I have no doubt if they had, if they were in the school systems now, the message they would be getting is that they're transgender, rather than they were just brought up with a mom who didn't feel like, you know, there was anything wrong with a boy wearing a pink shirt, or a girl wearing underoos with superheroes on them, and to me, that's what's the saddest, is that these kids are getting such a convoluted message about what it means to be male or female now.
Exactly. I mean, I grew up in a very strict fundamentalist religious household, so gender roles were imparted very strictly in my home growing up. And I remember when I was going through the therapy process for before I started cross sex hormones, and I was talking with the gender therapist about indicators that I might have been trans. And she asked me, what kind of toys did you play with? I said, well, I played with mostly Barbies and dolls, but I didn't really like to. I kind of always pulled the heads off my Barbies and things like that. I always wanted to play with Legos. Legos were my favorite, but I wasn't really supposed to play with them because that's more of a boy thing, right? Architecture is a boy thing. And the therapist globbed onto that and said, "Oh, well, obviously your rejection of Barbies means that you know,
Yikes.
we're never really a girl. You always wanted to be a boy." And looking
No.
back, it's like
What a
that's
horrible thing to think that any girl who rejects Barbies is actually a boy. Ah!
exactly. It's like, is that the requirement for being a woman now, is that you have to grow up loving Barbies? Because that is not something that I want to ascribe to. I don't want to live in that world.
Yeah, I didn't have a Barbie, growing up. I never played with Barbies. My daughter never had a Barbie growing up. And so, yeah, that's just, oh, I'm so sorry, Rachel. I feel so sad that you got that kind of therapy. I mean, it sounds like you were really let down by the system that was supposed to be there to help you.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I do want to take some responsibility because at the time I was an adult. However, I was a mentally ill adult.
See,
I was
that's I
vulnerable.
wanna just, like, before you go any further, just say I hear detransitioners over and over and over beating themselves up about it and saying, I'm responsible, I made the decision, it's my fault, I take full responsibility." And I just wanna say, wait, the context of what happened is so important that, first of all, so many had mental health issues. And the other thing is there aren't other paths at this point. It's not like you can go to a therapist who's likely going to help you with those underlying issues these days. In a lot of states, therapists are even banned from exploring those underlying issues. So I'm just preemptively saying I think that it's great for you to want to take responsibility, but at the same time I think it's really important for detransitioners to understand all the things that were in play and how that crippled your ability to consent.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I definitely will beat myself up about it. Looking back, again, because I was an adult, I feel some sort of responsibility to that process. But yeah, it's so frustrating to know that when someone is dealing with disassociation from their body, when they have a history of self harm or eating disorder or, you know, trauma or any issue, um, any sort of stress that is dividing their consciousness from their sex, um, like you said, they can't go and get help for that. Instead, they are going basically to get a letter that tells them that they are allowed to change their body to better accommodate their mental issues,
Yeah.
instead of treating the mental issues.
Yeah, it's really sometimes I just wake up and I'm like, this can't really be happening. This just makes no sense. It's like we have normalized the pathological and pathologized normal, and the world's just upside down. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about?
Um, I don't think so. I would encourage people who have concerns around this issue who are trying to get more involved. I would sincerely encourage them to try to consciously make an effort to humanize the people involved. Again, I know it's really easy to look at the procedures, it's really easy to look at the doctors, it's really easy to look at all of this and see it as ridiculousness and see it as um, somebody just going in without really considering their other options. Um, but trying to maintain compassion for the individual, I think, is really important.
Yeah, I think that that's super important, and I think anytime there's sort of a battle like this, it's so easy to forget that ultimately what we're fighting for is people, and we need to be just as concerned for those who have been sucked into this process as those who might be. And in fact, in some ways, supporting detransitioners is most important because any kid who gets pulled into this needs to know that if they decide to detransition, that there is going to be support for them on the other end. Um, because right now they're getting so much, affirmation and affection and attention as a result of transitioning. And if we don't provide them with support on the other end, then I think it's not unlikely they'll retransition.
I agree. And, you know, you're when you detransition, you give up a lot, whether
Mhm.
you're young or you're an adult. You're basically announcing to the world, "Hey, I made a mistake."
Yeah.
Um, and so you're humiliated, and then you also end up losing a lot of friends and losing a lot of your community and losing resources.
Yeah, I think that that's so important. One of the things that I was really confounded by is that when I started speaking publicly about my story, I had a lot of trans activists really attacking me, and I reached out to the local LGBT organization, and I said, "Well, don't I fall under your banner as someone who detransitioned, as someone who desisted? Am I not somehow part of that family, that community?" And they blocked me. And so you do risk losing a lot, and I can't imagine what that would be like if you lost your entire support community as an adult or as a teenager, how difficult that would be.
Yeah. And there's not really any uh, physical or mental health advocates out there who are able to provide resources and help to people detransitioning as well. So, you know, when you're detransitioning, you're going through the process of addressing your trauma. You're addressing these mental health issues finally for the first time, sometimes in a long time. And so you're going through the process of exiting out of this community you've been a part of, exiting out of this identity, this life you've been a part of for so long, and entering this world where now you've got all of this baggage, and you need someone to talk to about it, and you need someone who's going to care about your health, who is willing to understand that there might be long-term health consequences to what you did, um, and be able to help you through that. And unfortunately, we don't really have those resources right now.
Yeah, I'm hoping that there will be increasingly. I'm hearing more and more people talk about this need and trying to figure out, what's going to be the best way to do this. And I've almost wondered if sort of a recovery program model might be good, where you know there's a sort of people meet and they talk about it, but again, I don't know if we have a critical number of people to maintain something like that. It's like we are just at the cusp of understanding how much support detransitioners need. One of the things I would like to encourage people to do if they're watching this, in order to support detransitioners, is to contact your legislators, to contact insurance companies and tell them you want insurance coverage for detransitioners, so that they can kind of mitigate some of the harmful effects that happened, and some of the unwanted consequences of taking these medications. It's horrifying to me to find out that insurance companies are willing to pay for all of these um, procedures and interventions. But then if somebody detransitions and they're just as stressed and just as unhappy with how they look as they were when they transitioned, the insurance companies won't cover those procedures and treatments.
Yeah, I completely agree. Again, I haven't had surgeries that I've had to reverse, but I've known so many detransitioners who do, who have been through that process, and it's heartbreaking.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Rachel, for telling your story. I appreciate you, really being vulnerable and sharing your insights. I think it will help a lot of people.
Yeah, thank you for your time and for letting me speak. And you know, I really look forward to seeing how this movement progresses, and hopefully we can reach more young people and reach more adults and be able to have fluid conversation.